Welcome to Political Science 201. This is Laura Fleming. Thank you for being with us today. Today is our 7th lecture on the bureaucracy. So I wanted to ask the question, when have you interacted with the government bureaucracy, and was it a positive experience? What was it like? For most college students, the immediate example that comes to mind would be the DMV. Okay, so you remember when you had to go to the DMV to get your driver's license, or perhaps deal with some issues involving your car registration or your title. And what do you notice about the DMV? Well, you notice it's not a super happy and friendly place. So there's a lot of waiting around. There's a lot of paperwork. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why is that? Does the DMV have to be like that? Or is there some force that's making the DMV a more unpleasant experience than it has to be? I remember when I was taking one of my sons to get his permit, and the first thing I noticed about the DMV is the hours of operation. It's not super convenient. Okay, so the DMV is open maybe 8 to 4, which are the hours where most people are working, or like my son was in school, so I had to take off work and yank him out of school, go sit in line. And I thought, I'm an attorney, I'm pretty good at paperwork. I thought I had his paperwork all in order, but would you believe it? They dinged me not once, not twice, but 3 times. Okay, they dinged me because his certificate of enrollment at the high school was out of date. So apparently these certificates only last 30 days, right? And I said, well, you could just call over to the high school. They'll confirm that he would be there right now, except for the fact that he's here with you. But no, I need to go get another certificate of enrollment. And then they dinged me because my son and I have different last names. And, this happens sometimes, right? He had his birth certificate, but it said my first name, but the last name was different. And I said, can I just raise my right hand and swear that I'm his mom? Nobody but your mom is going to come in there and sit with you and go through this DMV ordeal. But no. I had to go back and get all the documentation and the paperwork showing that I actually was the same Laura as the Laura on the birth certificate. And then finally, they were looking through my paperwork and saw that there was a typo on the driver's ed certificate. Okay, so my son had to have a certificate that he completed driver's ed, which he did, and there was a typo on the certificate. It was obviously a typo, but the DMV official refused to move forward. She refused to call the driver's ed company and confirm that it was just a typo, like we all knew it was a typo. No. I had to go get a new driver's ed form. So this meant that I had to go on a fetch quest for the DMV the next day or two, collect all the new documents, and then take off work, take my son out of school, and go through the whole process one more time. Not a happy experience. If you click on this link here in the slide, I included a little foreign film clip. It's very funny. Okay, this is a young woman who goes to a bureaucratic agency seeking a permit so that she can work as a freelance worker. And it's a story of how she overcame the bureaucracy. I think it's a great little story. I want to be like her when I grow up. So I encourage you to take a look at that story. Totally fictional, but shows how one woman overcame the bureaucracy. So we're going to talk about this today. Why are bureaucratic agencies like this. Okay, as we've discussed, we're going to talk about the bureaucracy today. We're going to talk about what the bureaucracy does. What is the bureaucracy? We're going to talk about how it differs from private business. So again, bureaucratic agencies do have a different vibe from private businesses. We'll talk about that. We'll go through some examples of bureaucratic agencies. And finally, there have been some efforts to kind of tame the bureaucracy and increase transparency. We'll talk a little bit about that. I want to read to you from a political commentator. His name is Yuval Levin. He talks about the experience that we have with bureaucracies. He says, in our everyday experience, the bureaucratic state presents itself not as a benevolent provider and protector, but as a corpulent behemoth, flabby, slow, and expressionless, unmoved by our concerns, demanding compliance with arcane and seemingly meaningless rules as it breathes musty air in our faces and sends us to the back of the line. Okay, so we're going to again talk about this universal experience with bureaucracy. As we discussed last time, most of the federal government is bureaucracy. So up at the top of the org chart here, we have the Constitution. We have the three branches of government discussed in the Constitution. Article 1, Congress. Article 2, the President. Article 3, the Supreme Court or the federal court system. And then this whole bottom of the org chart, we have first the 15 major government departments. Remember, they're headed up by individuals called secretaries. And then we have all of the umpteen alphabet soup of independent government agencies. And the question is, where did this structure come from? It did not come from the Constitution. So the bureaucracy is part of the executive branch, at least in name. Okay, so it's part of the enforcement arm of the federal government, but it exercises powers delegated by Congress. So you remember we discussed the fact that in the progressive era, the progressives wanted to get things done, and they felt that the channels provided by the Constitution for getting things done were too narrow, that Congress was very political. It often got gridlocked, and they came up with a solution of separating politics from administration. So the idea is that Congress could discuss and deliberate and debate and kind of cast the grand vision, we want clean air. And then they would create a bureaucratic agency, the EPA, Environmental Protection Act, and the EPA would actually take care of the details. And so the power to regulate, the power to come up with the legal details was delegated by Congress to these executive administrative agencies. And one of the big things that the bureaucracy does is it writes regulations. They pump out tens of thousands of pages of regulations every year. I have a quote here from a woman named Martha Kent. She was the OSHA Director of Safety Standards Program. So OSHA is Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and she's talking about her job, and she says, quote, I like having a very direct and very powerful impact on worker safety and health. If you put out a reg, it matters. I think that's really where the thrill comes from, and it is a thrill. It's a high. I love it. I absolutely love it. I was born to regulate. I don't know why. It's very true. As long as I'm regulating, I'm happy. Okay, so on the one hand, we can appreciate Ms. Kent's enthusiasm for her job. We can be glad that she enjoys regulating. But also, we should be a little concerned about the situation as well, especially when she talks about how she gets a thrill from regulating. She loves it. You know, what's giving her the thrill? Well, the thrill is telling other people what to do, right? And then she says, I was born to regulate. And, you know, that begs the question, if certain people were born to regulate, does that mean that the rest of us were born to be regulated? You know, that doesn't sound quite right. So this is one of the functions of the bureaucratic agencies, is to write regulations. Not only that, the agencies investigate violations. So if you violate one of these regulations put out by one of these agencies, they will start an investigation. And at the end of their investigation, they will decide what the fines and the penalties are in your particular case. Now, if you're paying attention, you'll see that many bureaucratic agencies have an executive function, enforcement function, but they also have a legislative function. They're making laws, making regulations, and they have a judicial function by applying and interpreting the laws in particular cases. And the question is, what in the heck happened to separation of powers? Remember, our founders were maniacal about separating out the different kinds of powers: the power to make laws, the power to enforce laws, the power to interpret and apply laws in specific cases. And here we see all of these powers consolidated in these administrative agencies. And not only that, the agencies are not even elected. So the administrative agencies don't even have the voice of the people to keep them in check. Let me read to you. This is a quote from a Harvard Law Review article by Boston University law professor Gary Lawson, and he's talking about the Federal Trade Commission, which is an administrative agency. Okay, they regulate trade. He says the Federal Trade Commission promulgates substantive rules of conduct. They create regulations. The Commission then considers whether to authorize investigations into whether the Commission's rules have been violated. If the Commission authorizes an investigation, the investigation is conducted by the Commission, which reports its findings to the Commission. If the Commission thinks that the Commission's findings warrant an enforcement action, the Commission issues a complaint. The Commission's complaint that a Commission rule has been violated is then prosecuted by the Commission and adjudicated by the Commission. This Commission adjudication can either take place before the full Commission or before a semi-autonomous Commission administrative law judge. So the Commission makes the rule, investigates a violation, and they have their own judges to decide cases. If the decision is adverse to the Commission, so if on the off chance the Commission judge makes a decision that the Commission doesn't like, the Commission can appeal to the Commission. If the Commission ultimately finds a violation, then and only then the affected private party can appeal to an outside federal court. Okay, so you have to go through all of these internal administrative procedures before you can even get to an outside neutral court and neutral judge. But even before the bona fide outside federal law court, the decision by the Commission possesses a very strong presumption of correctness on matters of both fact and law. So in other words, let's say you get through this nightmare, all the hoops internal to the Commission, and you appeal to an outside judge. The outside judge, more likely than not, is going to say, well, you know, the Commission has special expertise and we don't really want to go against the Commission. We don't want to get into all the weeds. We're just going to presume that the Commission's decision is probably correct. So you see there what an ordeal it is, how much you do not want to get caught in the web of a bureaucratic agency, precisely because of this lack of separation of powers. So we talked about the fact that the federal government is much, much larger than it was in the time of the founders. It's involved in every aspect of our lives. You remember this special bookcase to hold the number of pages of regulations, 80,000 pages of regulations issued just in 1 year, okay, just in 2013. And again, President Trump is trying to roll back some of these regulations with mixed success. There are over 3 million, approximately 3 million or so federal civilian government workers, and almost half of the population receives some form of government benefit. So we've all become very used to the government taking care of us. There's a certain vision involved in the bureaucratic state, and I'm going to read from Yuval Levin again here. He says, from birth to death, citizens should be ensconced in a series of protections and benefits intended to shield them from the harsh edges of the market and allow them to pursue dignified, fulfilling lives. So these are the benefits that we come to expect from our government. Universal child care, universal health care, universal public school and higher education, welfare for the poor, labor protections for workers, dexterous management of the levers of the economy to ease these cycles of boom and bust, skillful direction of public funds to spur private productivity, and finally pensions for the elderly. Each component ideally would be overseen by a competent and rational bureaucracy, and the whole would make for a system not only beneficent but unifying and dignifying and enabling the pursuit of common national goals and ideals. Okay, so we have this vision of a government that cares for us from cradle to grave, an idea that would be very, very foreign to the founders. Okay, if you click on this link here, and I hope that you do, it's very interesting, you'll see an infographic that was used for President Obama's second run for president. Okay, so this is an infographic that President Obama used in his election campaign, and it's called The Life of Julia. Okay, so basically it takes the life of a woman starting with age 3 and goes all the way through the end of her life. And it's a very interesting story. Okay, so in the PowerPoint you can click through this infographic, or you can just Google Life of Julia. But I'm going to go through these stages in her life to give you kind of a flavor for this. So in the first slide, Julia is 3 years old, okay, little Julia, very cute. And the infographic says Julia is enrolled in a Head Start program to help her get ready for school. Because of steps President Obama has taken to improve programs like this one, Julia joins thousands of students across the country who will start kindergarten ready to learn and succeed. Then we have the next slide. Julia is 17. She takes the SAT and is on track to start college applications. Her high school is part of the Race to the Top program implemented by President Obama. Their new college and career-ready standards ensure that Julia can take the classes she needs to do well. Now you have Julia at 18. She's preparing for her first semester of college, and she qualifies for President Obama's American Opportunity Tax Credit, and she also gets a Pell Grant to help put her college education within reach. Julia is now 22. During college, Julia undergoes surgery. So this is one of the harsh edges of life. Sometimes we have medical complications, and that happens to Julia. But thankfully, her surgery is covered by her insurance due to a provision in healthcare reform that lets her stay on her parents' coverage until she turns 26. Here's Julia at age 23. Because of steps like the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, Julia is one of millions of women across the country who knows she'll always be able to stand up for her right to equal pay, and she starts her career as a web designer. So you can kind of see the target audience for this infographic. They're leaning pretty heavily into ages 17, 18, 23. Here she is at age 25. After graduation, so I guess she's on the extended college program here. After graduation, Julia's federal student loans are more manageable since President Obama capped income-based federal student loan programs and kept interest rates low. So Julia is a good citizen. She makes her payments on time every month, keeping her on track to repay her student loans. Age 27. For the past 4 years, Julia has worked full-time as a web designer. Thanks to Obamacare, her health insurance is required to cover birth control and preventive care, letting Julia focus on her work rather than worry about her health. Here she is, age 31. Julia decides to have a child. Throughout her pregnancy, she benefits from maternal checkups, prenatal care, and free screenings under health care reform. So there's a cute little picture of Julia and her baby bump. Age 37, there's Julia and her little son. Julia's son, Zachary, starts kindergarten. The public schools in their neighborhood have better facilities and great teachers because of President Obama's investments in education. Age 42, Julia starts her own web business. She qualifies for a small business administration loan, helping businesses like Julia's to get started. Here she is, age 65. Wait a minute, they just buzzed through 42 to 65. They just skipped over the best years of Julia's life. I don't know how they did that. Anyway, here she is, age 65. Julia enrolls in Medicare, helping her to afford preventive care and the prescription drugs she needs. Age 67, Julia retires. After years of contributing to Social Security, she receives monthly benefits that help her retire comfortably without worrying she'll run out of savings. This allows her to volunteer at a community garden. So that's our last little picture of Julia in retirement working at the community garden. I like to ask my students, what do you think about the life of Julia? And they say, sounds pretty comfortable, that she sounds like she's pretty secure. She's kind of just sailing along. And, I ask them, what's missing from Julia's life? And they think about it, and usually some character will say, she didn't have a husband, okay? And that is kind of a glaring omission. At age 31, Julia decides to have a child, right? Maybe by immaculate conception. I don't know. There's no husband, no boyfriend, not even a baby daddy. It's like, that's kind of weird. And in fact, that's what you notice throughout the life of Julia, is that there are no other people, okay? It's just Julia and government programs, Julia and President Obama against the world, right? So they never show her parents. It's just Julia at 3 years old waiting to get picked up at the bus stop. They never show her roommates, her members of her faith community, her professors, her extended family, friends, nothing. They don't show any other people in her life. It's a very lonely life. There's one slide where her son Zachary shows up, age 5. Okay, so and he hops on the bus, goes to kindergarten. We never see him again either, even when she's retired you'd think Zachary would come help her work in the community garden, but no, it's Julia all by herself. And that's kind of a sad view of life, that we need the government to protect us from all the harsh edges, and it makes it sound like we don't have any other options, when we do. We have lots of other options that don't involve paperwork, bureaucracy, and people who love to regulate, right? So we'll talk about that. But it's my hope that if you guys run into trouble in your lives, that your lives are not lonely like Julia, and that you do have actual live people in your life to help you out. So the bureaucracy, again, very active, has very few checks and balances. So the book, which is pretty progressive, okay, the book kind of buys into the progressive idea that Americans need to be cared for from cradle to grave. And the book tries to stick up for the bureaucracy. So I'm reading from the textbook, page 286. It says, many people associate the word bureaucracy with the federal government. They visualize rows of cubicles with nameless clerical workers inefficiently shuffling papers. The problem with this joke is that these parodied traits are no more common among government bureaucrats than among workers in the bureaucracy of a private company. So the textbook is saying, don't be so hard on the government bureaucracy, that in fact, private companies have bureaucracy too, and we've been there also. You've waited in line for customer service or waited on hold in voicemail hell, right? Press 1, press 3, press 0 for an operator and wait for an hour. So that does happen. But fundamentally, there are some big differences between the federal bureaucracy and private businesses. Okay, they're very fundamental differences, and once you look at them, you'll realize, that's why bureaucracies behave that way. Okay, so the first question that you want to ask about bureaucracy versus private business is, what's the goal? Okay, what's the goal of a private business? Well, the goal of a private business is to make a profit. Okay, to make a profit. And at first that sounds kind of greedy, right? Those corporations, all they want to do is make money. But you ask yourself, okay, how exactly do they make money? Well, they make money by providing goods and services that people want. Okay, so the way they make money is they come up with a good or a service that people want, and then we give them money for those goods and services. So the way they make a profit is by giving us stuff that we either want or need. So it kind of works out for everybody. The goal of a bureaucratic agency is very nebulous. Okay, that goal is to implement policy. Okay, so we have an education policy or environment policy, and so the bureaucracy has to implement that, and it's very squishy. And the one way you can see this is, okay, how can you tell if you're a private business? How can you tell if you're not meeting your goal? How can you tell if you're not making a profit? Well, that's very easy. You look at the bottom line. If you're losing money, then you're not making a profit. You're not reaching your goal. You have to take action. How does an agency know if they're implementing policy correctly? Let's take, for example, education policy. How does a bureaucracy know if its education policy is being implemented in a way that is helpful? Well, these things can take a long time, right? So maybe you can call in some experts, do some tests, do a longitudinal study, try to figure out, are these kids better off before than or after implementation of this new educational program. But it's very squishy. It takes a lot of time and effort and kind of subjective. You don't know right away. Not only that, by the time you figure out whether or not a policy is working, perhaps we have a change in Congress or a change in the president, and our government leaders have moved on, and maybe the policies change, or maybe they're not interested in that policy anymore. So, it's all very nebulous and squishy and difficult to measure. So, private companies face competition. If you don't like your iPhone, okay, Google has Android, there's other phone models out there, and Apple knows that if you don't like their phones, that you have other choices. So, they're going to try and compete and keep prices as low as possible and make their product as, shiny and attractive as possible. In a bureaucracy, they don't have competition. They are a monopoly. So when you go to the DMV, they're not competing for your services, okay? So you kind of have to go to the DMV if you want a driver's license. And you may think, oh, well, the DMV in Farmerville is a little nicer, a little less crowded than the DMV in Ruston. Maybe I'll go there. DMV in Ruston, that's no skin off their back, right? I mean, it's just less customers for them. So bureaucracies don't face competition. That gives them a much different attitude toward customers. Private companies get immediate feedback, okay? If you don't like what Walmart's doing, you don't have to shop there. Don't like what Target's doing, you don't have to shop there. You can give feedback with your feet, and if enough people give them that kind of feedback, then it'll be quite painful, and they'll be motivated to change. But how do you give feedback to a government agency? Very difficult. Maybe you can try to talk to an elected official, or maybe you can vote for someone who's running on a platform of reforming a government agency, but that's very indirect. Maybe you can file a lawsuit if you've been treated wrong, but lawsuits are expensive, they take a long time. Nobody's going to file a lawsuit because they had to wait at the DMV for 3 hours and then go do a fetch quest, right? So very difficult to give a bureaucratic agency feedback. But wait, there's more. Private companies have a flexible structure, okay? So if you're the owner of a business, you can reorganize that business as you see fit, okay? So there's a division that's not doing very well, you can sell off that division or reduce that division. You can do restructuring. You can decide that you want to branch into different areas. Bureaucracies have a very slow and rigid structure. We've seen the budgetary process, okay, so the process where, subcommittees in Congress are tasked with coming up with the annual budget for their particular agencies. And if you're a government agency, you really don't want to make a lot of noise. You don't want to lose any of the budget that you have, and so, it's you just want to get your budget passed by the subcommittee and the committee and make its way through Congress. And that means that you're not very nimble, okay? You're not going to try new things. You don't want to bring undue attention to your organization and its budget by, showing innovation. So a lot of bureaucracies have kind of a slow and rigid structure, not easy to change. And what happens if there's a change in conditions that's between the annual budgetary process, then you're kind of stuck, right? So bureaucracies have very slow and rigid structures. Private companies have the ability to fire workers. Okay, we think firing workers, that's not much fun to be fired, right? I've been laid off before. It's not great. I've helped companies lay people off. Believe it or not, that's not fun either, okay? Your employer invests significant resources in recruiting you and training you, and they don't really want to fire you either. But sometimes firing workers is necessary, okay? So circumstances changed, and when a company fires a worker, what it does is it frees you up to go work somewhere else that's a better fit, and it frees them up to find somebody to replace you who is a better fit, or else just do away with the position completely. So it's kind of a necessary evil, this ability to fire workers. Let's see what happens in a public agency. In a bureaucratic agency, it's very difficult to fire even bad workers. Okay, so what happens is, these bureaucratic agencies, they write regulations, and there's not a lot of checks and balances. So basically, they write the regulations on how you can fire a government worker. And without checks and balances, they make it very difficult to fire government workers. Usually you have to jump through various hoops. You have to stay on paid leave for a while there's an investigation. Okay, most government agencies will not even bother trying to fire workers. It's just too difficult. And that leads to headlines like this one. Okay, let me get my headline here. This is from the Washington Times, and the headline is about porn surfing feds. For one Federal Communications Commission worker, his porn habit at work was easy to explain. Things were slow, he told investigators, so he perused it out of boredom for up to 8 hours each week. And the article goes into the fact that this is not just an issue at the Federal Communications Commission. Many other agencies have similar problems with workers wasting time on the computer when they should be working, up to and including using porn. Here's a public service announcement. Don't watch porn at work. Okay, so if you're at a private company, they will find out. Okay, there's ways of finding out what your employees are looking at while at work. If you're looking at porn, it's a big risk to the company, plus it's just nasty, and you will very likely get fired. Okay, so don't mess with that stuff. But if you work at a government agency, again, very difficult to fire employees. I have a press release here. Let me find it. From the Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Okay, this is a man who's in the President's cabinet. All right, this is one of the heads of the 12 major government departments, one of the most powerful people in the government. And the Secretary of Veterans Affairs put out this press release saying help. Why does he need help? Well, in Houston, they caught an employee watching porn while they were supposed to be caring for a patient. Okay, so this employee was supposed to be taking care of this disabled veteran, and instead they were watching porn, which is just nasty. And even the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, one of the most powerful people in the government, a member of the President's cabinet, had no power to fire this employee. Okay, so he had to put the employee on paid leave for 30 days, jump through all these hoops, do all these investigations. And the Secretary of Veterans Affairs says this is an example why we need accountability legislation. It's unacceptable. We have to wait 30 days while the employee's getting paid, so basically a month-long paid vacation, to act on a proposed firing. Okay, so that goes to show you what happens when you make it difficult to fire even bad workers. Private companies are fueled by voluntary customers and investors. So in other words, if you don't want to support a private company, you don't have to. Okay, you can spend your money there, or you cannot spend your money there. It's totally up to you. You can invest in the stock of a private company, or you can choose not to invest. Government bureaucracy is very different. Government bureaucracy is funded by involuntary taxpayers. So in other words, let's say that you go to the DMV, you feel you're not treated very well. Guess what? Not only do you still have to go to the DMV the next time you have an issue with your driver's license or your registration, you also have to pay for the DMV. It's mandatory, okay? You can't tell the government, oh, you know, I didn't have a good experience with that agency, or you know, I have a moral objection to what that agency is doing. You're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to carve out parts of your taxes. Your tax dollars go to fund all these agencies, even the agencies that don't treat you well, and even the agencies that you have a moral disagreement with. So, which type of organization would you expect to be more responsive and more efficient? The incentives are aligned to where it makes sense for someone at a private company to be concerned about the interests of the customers and their well-being and their happiness, because if you're happy, then they make money and it's all good. But a government bureaucracy does not really have that same incentive to treat you well and do what you want, okay? Their incentive is mostly just to perpetuate the bureaucracy. And this is not to put down individual government employees, right? So I'm sure there are many very loyal, hardworking, customer service oriented employees in various government bureaucracies, okay? And God bless them, because as we've seen, you know, it's even more difficult to keep your integrity and your customer service mindedness when you're working in a government institution. You know, technically I work for a state university, so I could be considered part of a bureaucracy, right? So this is not intended as a critique of any particular government worker. This is just a critique of the bureaucratic system and the incentives that it supports. You can click on this link here when you get the chance, when you're looking at the PowerPoint. This is a clip from the Washington Post, and I kind of like it because it's the bureaucracy getting a taste of its own medicine. Okay, so it's about a bureaucracy that processes paperwork for retired government workers. Okay, so basically, if you're retiring from government service from the federal government, then you have to send your paperwork to the Office of Personnel Management, and they have this big cavernous mine underground with like thousands of rows of file cabinets. It's really quite impressive, and they have all this paperwork involved and all this backlog, and it's kind of an example of, you know, government workers having to endure a taste of government bureaucracy. So take a few minutes and look at that when you download the PowerPoint to study. I'd like to go through some examples of the federal bureaucracy, specifically in the workplace. This is something that I know something about. I'm an employment law attorney, so this means that as part of my work for almost 20 years now, I've been helping companies comply with all of the various regulations that are churned out by all the different government agencies regulating the workplace. For example, you have the Federal Department of Labor. The Department of Labor regulates working conditions, which includes wages and hours. You would think that an individual and their company would be able to agree among themselves what hours they would work and how much and how they would get paid, but that's not the case. This is a highly, highly regulated area, especially by the Department of Labor. Then you have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The EEOC enforces anti-discrimination laws. So they make sure that people are not harassed or discriminated or retaliated against in the workplace based on protected categories. Now, all of these are good goals. We don't want people to be discriminated against. We don't want people taken advantage of. But as you'll see, these agencies tend to take on a life of their own. There's also agencies that regulate workplace safety, union rights. There's special rules for government contract workers, rules about unemployment benefits, and much, much more. All of these regulations can be confusing and also costly for small businesses as well as for large businesses. One thing you may have noticed is these labor law posters. All of these various government agencies, they want workers to know what they do for them. Okay, it's kind of advertising for these bureaucracies. And so they require companies to post notices related to their agencies. And there's a lot of agencies, so there's also a lot of notices. If you work somewhere like a grocery store or restaurant, if you've ever gone in the break room, you may have seen a labor law poster that looks kind of like this one. Now, there's so many posters and they're so complex to keep up with that you actually have private companies that step in and provide labor law poster services. Okay, so these private companies come in and they'll give you a very nice laminated all-in-one labor law poster that you can put on your bulletin board, and they'll update it for you every year for a little charge. But that will relieve your company of the burden of having to figure out all this stuff on its own. It gets really interesting in places like California because in addition to these federal laws, these national agencies, states like California have their own overlapping layer of state agencies. Okay, so you have California equivalents to the Department of Labor, the EEOC, OSHA, etc. And all of these state level agencies want you to know about them as well. They want you to put up their posters too. And then even in some big cities are starting to get into the game where the cities will put city level ordinances about minimum wage and sick pay and family leave, and they'll want you to put posters about that as well. So all of these posters, if you go to a workplace in California, many times they'll be overflowing the bulletin board. You won't just have a bulletin board with labor law posters. You'll have an entire wallpaper with labor law posters on them, all of the different overlapping agencies. And these agencies don't necessarily talk to each other before they put out their regulations. I have two papers here in front of me. The first one is a fact sheet from the U.S. Department of Labor. And this fact sheet from the Department of Labor has to do with wellness programs. So basically, under the Affordable Care Act, under Obamacare, the idea was that employers would be encouraged to have wellness programs. So what is a wellness program? A wellness program is where you give your employees a little spiff, a little incentives to do things that are good for their health. So like if the employee loses weight or lowers their blood pressure or exercises or stops smoking, that kind of thing, then you can get some kind of small token incentive, okay? And under the Affordable Care Act, promulgated by the Department of Labor, also the Department of Health and Human Services, they were all about these employer wellness programs. Then I have in my other hand a press release, and this is from the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And the EEOC says that basically they're saying that they filed a lawsuit. They're putting out a press release because they filed a lawsuit. They're going after a plastics manufacturing company for discriminating. And you might ask, oh, that's terrible. What was the plastics company doing? Well, they had a wellness program, and the EEOC determined that their wellness program discriminated based on disability. Okay, so if you have a wellness program and you're asking about employee health conditions and you're giving out benefits based on health metrics, that can easily discriminate against people based on disability, according to the EEOC. So this poor plastics manufacturing company is stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, the Department of Labor is pushing these employer wellness programs, and on the other hand, the EEOC is suing employers because their wellness programs are discriminatory. And that kind of thing happens all the time. These agencies do not consult with each other when they're pumping out the regulations. Okay, let's do a little bit deeper dive into the Department of Labor. Department of Labor contains many sub-agencies. If you click on that link there, you can see all the different sub-agencies in the Department of Labor. They have a wage and hour division specifically dedicated to regulating the wages and hours of work. And there is a strong emphasis on employee protection over flexibility. So if I can give you just a brief introduction to employee classification in the United States. So there's three classes of workers. The first class is independent contractors. So independent contractors have a lot of flexibility. If you're an independent contractor, you can choose when to work, how to work. You choose your clients. Okay, your clients usually pay you by the job. So this is like when you were a kid, you were mowing lawns. You would say, okay, I'll charge you, $20 or $40 to mow that lawn, and you would be an independent contractor. And the homeowner really wouldn't care how you did it as long as you did a good job. They were paying you by the job. So it's very flexible. On the other hand, independent contractors have a certain amount of risk because let's say you're mowing someone's lawn and your lawnmower hits a rock and it gets damaged. You have to take care of that yourself, okay? And if it's a big damage to your mower, potentially you could lose money on a job, right? So there's some risk to being an independent contractor, but that's basically the small business entrepreneur model. The next category of worker in the U.S. is a salary worker. This means a worker gets paid a certain amount of money every month, and the employer does not really care how many hours they work as long as, again, they get the job done. So they consider you to be a professional. Let's say you're working for, $5,000 a month, something like that. And they consider you to be a professional. You come in, you do your job. If you need to take a little bit longer lunch, leave a little early, run some errands, your employer doesn't care. They know that when they need you, that you be willing to take some calls from home or work a little later, etc. Okay, so that is a fairly flexible arrangement to be paid by salary. There's a third category that most of you are probably familiar with, and that is the hourly rate. Okay, so the hourly rate means that the employee is paid by the hour. Okay, so the employee has to clock in on the time clock, clock out, take a lunch break, clock back in after lunch, and then work, and then clock back out at the end of the day. And so basically, there's zero flexibility. You have to be where your manager wants you. You have to clock in and out. But the flip side is that it's no risk to be an hourly employee. You get paid for every hour that you work as an hourly employee. And it doesn't really matter what happens on the job. If things are slow, you still get paid. If you work past 8 hours a day in some places or 40 hours a week in nationwide, you get paid overtime. All right, so hourly workers, not much flexibility. You're kind of tied to that time clock, but it's also not much risk because you're basically a warm body. You do what you're told and you get paid for the time that you're working. So many people enjoy being an independent contractor because of the flexibility. They enjoy working on a salary because, they don't have to keep track of their time. They just have to do their work. They're treated as a professional. But these categories make government agencies very anxious. Okay, so government agencies are here to protect you. They're very worried that, God forbid, you'd have to stay late and not get compensated for that. And so they want you to be aware of all their protections. And the default, the big push by these government agencies is for everybody to be an hourly employee. And there's actually very strict regulatory barriers to working on a salary. You have to make a certain amount of money to be a salary employee. You also can only work on a salary if you're performing certain kinds of jobs. So only certain jobs are eligible to be paid by salary, and there's minimum salaries, etc. And government agencies have a full-on war against the independent contractor classification. Okay, so even if you want to be an independent contractor and you sign an agreement with your client that you're performing the work as an independent contractor, these government agencies can come in and invalidate all of that and say, no, you must be classified as an hourly worker punching that time clock. So there is a little video. If you click this link here, it's a little video by the Department of Labor, and it's a cute little story about Sam and Maddie. Okay, and so the Department of Labor is trying to justify its policies that are making it very difficult to work on a salary. And so they're saying that poor Sam and poor Maddie, they work so hard and they don't get overtime because they're salary employees. So the Department of Labor is going to raise the barrier, raise the minimum wage for salary, and then Sam and Maddie, their employers, will have to make a choice. They'll either have to pay them overtime for hours that they work more than 40 hours a week, or they'll have to raise their salary to the new minimum. And it all sounds great, and it makes you think, wow, thank you, Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Division, look at what you're doing for Sam and Maddie. But you have to remember the trade-off, okay? Every time the Department of Labor offers you more security, there's a trade-off in your freedom. Okay, first of all, this little video makes it sound like if Sam or Maddie feels like they're overworked, that they're not able to address the problem themselves. There's many things that Sam and Maddie could do. They could go talk to their boss, for example, and say, hey, I am overworked. What can we do about this? I either need a raise or I need a little help. Or they could, look for a different job where their skills will be more appreciated. So the question is, do Sam and Maddie really need the Department of Labor to come in and make a more burdensome regulation that applies across the nation. And let's say you have another employee, Melissa. And Melissa is paid a salary and she's very happy and she has a kind of a cushy job and she does not feel overworked. But let's say the Department of Labor passes their new regulation and all of a sudden Melissa's employer says, look, Melissa, we can't afford to raise your salary to the new minimum. Maybe we could have afforded to raise it a little bit, but we can't raise it to, by $7,000 or $10,000. So we're going to have to convert you to an hourly employee. And this means that now Melissa is going to be a slave to the time clock. Okay, she wasn't overworked. She didn't have a problem. She liked her job. It was flexible. But now because of this one-size-fits-all Department of Labor regulation, Melissa is going to have to push a time clock. She's going to have to clock in and clock out for lunch and clock back in and then clock back out at the end of her shift. And if she has to leave a little early to run a little errand, she's not going to get paid her full 40 hours. Okay, so she has to be very diligent. All of a sudden, you've just put a lot of paperwork and administrative burden on Melissa for no reason other than the Department of Labor was supposedly trying to help Sam and Maddie when really Sam and Maddie probably could have helped themselves, So this is the general trajectory of government agencies. Again, the EEOC enforces anti-discrimination laws in the workplace. They issue press releases from their newsroom, basically bragging about all the companies that they've sued for discrimination. If you take a look at this link here, you'll see that the EEOC has sued Coca-Cola Bottle Company of Mobile. So what did Coca-Cola Bottling Company of Mobile actually do? Well, they hired a male forklift driver. Okay, so there was a woman who applied to be a forklift driver, and this woman was not chosen for the job. She complained to the EEOC, and the EEOC filed a lawsuit, and the EEOC issued a press release about its lawsuit. And everybody's saying, oh, shame, shame, Coca-Cola Bottling Company of Mobile, they don't think women can drive forklifts. Well, we don't really know, okay? So anybody can file a lawsuit about anything, including the EEOC, and we don't know what the reason was that this woman was not hired until the case is assessed by a judge or a jury. Okay, this case has not been assessed by a judge or a jury, at least not as of the time of the press release. The EEOC was only saying that it filed a lawsuit, right? So we don't know. Maybe Coca-Cola Bottling Company of Mobile had backwards misogynist views, or maybe the man that they hired was just more qualified than the woman forklift driver. We just don't know. But we do know there's going to be a lot of pressure on Coca-Cola Bottling Company of Mobile to settle this case. And that's generally what happens, is that employers will settle these cases. They'll pay money to the, for example, female forklift driver just to get out of this case because it costs so much time and effort and energy and bad press to fight it. Of course, we don't want people to be discriminated against in the workplace. But the question is this the best way to end discrimination? I mean, we've had the EEOC now for over 50 years. Have race relations in the workplace improved? I don't know. We'll talk more about that when we talk about civil rights. The EEOC puts out many technical rules. One example has to do with accommodation of service animals. So we have something called the Americans with Disabilities Act that's enforced by the EEOC, and there's a lot of regulations about how companies need to accommodate employees with disabilities. And one group of regulations has to do with service animals. So if you need a service animal, God bless you, and your company absolutely should accommodate you. But people get so tied up in knots about getting into trouble with the EEOC that they'll do ridiculous things. For example, take a turkey onto an airplane. Okay, Delta Airlines actually allowed a passenger to take a turkey onto the airplane as a service animal. I live in the country in Dubach. I actually have turkeys. We had a very nice turkey. Her name was Annabelle. Super friendly. You could scratch her belly, pat her on the head. She would eat corn right out of your hand. I would never take Annabelle on an airplane because turkeys are wild animals. They're not predictable. They're not house trained. And it's pretty foolish to allow someone to take a live turkey on an airplane as a service animal. Okay, and people do these things because they're worried about getting into trouble with the EEOC. If you click this link I have here, you'll have another example of competing regulations. So we have the Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration regulates food and drugs, and they have regulations that say that you should not have animals in food preparation areas. Okay, you don't want to have pets, cats, dogs, etc., in areas where you prepare food for safety and sanitation. Then you have the Americans with Disabilities Act that says employers must accommodate service animals. So let's say you're a restaurant employer and you have an employee who works at your restaurant that has a service animal. Oh no, what do you do? Because the FDA says no animals in the food prep areas, but the EEOC says you have to accommodate service animals. Now, in an ideal world, what would happen is the boss would sit down with the employee and they would talk it out and they would decide, what would be reasonable, and can we make this work? And they'd come up with a solution that would work for them, or else they would agree that there's no good solution and perhaps the employee should find a different kind of job, work in an office or something like that, okay? But these are bureaucratic agencies, so what they do is they issue regulations. If you click on that link, you'll see, just pages of regulations trying to, guide employers through this rock in this hard place, instead of just letting employers and employees sit down and work it out using their common sense. Enormous public and private resources are spent investigating juvenile workplace disputes. Okay, so I'll give you an example. My clients, by now they know the drill and they have extensive policies and procedures absolutely forbidding discrimination and harassment. Okay, so they tell their employees, don't be inappropriate in the workplace. You have to be professional. You can't say things that might be interpreted as racist or sexist, etc. But people say stupid stuff anyway, right? So I had a case where there was two employees, a gay guy and a Hispanic woman. Okay, so the Hispanic woman allegedly called the gay guy princess, and the gay guy allegedly asked the Hispanic woman if he could borrow her husband. Okay, so you had kind of cross complaints here, and they both filed complaints, and the EEOC investigated this thing. Okay, there was an actual EEOC investigator assigned to figure out whether my client, the company, had allowed harassment to take place in the workplace. And this was despite the fact that my client was always pleading with the employees, don't say stupid stuff like that. Okay, so the EEOC investigated. The company hired me to help them respond to the EEOC. I actually had to do my own investigation, wrote up a 7 or 8 page response letter laying everything out nice and neat for the EEOC, why my client actually does not tolerate discrimination and harassment. And then the EEOC wanted to do interviews, so I had to sit on the phone while the EEOC interviewed various participants in this alleged exchange of inappropriate comments, right? And the whole thing was ridiculous. Why should we spend taxpayer money on investigating juvenile workplace disputes? Why should my client have to pay me quite a bit of money to defend them in these kinds of proceedings? Okay, it really has gotten out of control. Let's talk a little bit about the Food and Drug Administration. FDA requires drug commercials to include side effects. So I have a little fun clip for you guys. Jeff Foxworthy, he does his take on drug side effects. Okay, he has a pretend commercial for a drug called Floraflor, where the side effects are worse than the disease. Okay, and we laugh at that. We laugh at these drug commercials because they have the whole laundry list of side effects. This is not the fault of the drug companies. Okay, so the FDA requires them to include side effects, and it's all very heavily scripted. So drug companies want to know, okay, we want to engage with our customers on social media, but how do we do that? How do we have a dialogue with our customers? Because, you can't go run back and ask your attorney before you respond to an instant message, and certainly if you're using Twitter to tweet about a drug or a medical product, there's not enough room with the characters to include the side effects. So you'll notice that most drug companies, if they're online, they have very static web pages. They're not interactive at all. And that's because of the FDA. The FDA basically won't allow these drug companies to interact with customers. They beg the FDA for guidance on the use of social media, but bureaucracies can be very slow to keep up with new technology. So by the time the FDA issues its regulations about how drug companies can interact on Facebook, by then all the cool people will be on some different platform. So the result is that if you want your questions answered about a drug, and let's say you go online and you Google, the drug companies are the ones that have all the information about the drugs. They're not allowed to give you any of that information. They're not allowed to answer your questions. So you get a bunch of anecdotal information from the quacks and kooks on the internet, and who knows if that information is correct. And this is all, there's even during the coronavirus, the current coronavirus threat, the FDA has been a barrier to finding effective treatment. Okay, one of the reasons it takes so long to find effective treatments and to get that vaccine and to get the treatments to the public is because of all the red tape at the FDA. And there's some hope maybe the FDA will cut some of that back because of the coronavirus and the need to act swiftly. We'll see if that happens. Again, I don't want drug companies to be rash and to make people sick without appropriate standards of safety. But at the same time, when you have a bureaucracy in charge, the bureaucracy does tend to get somewhat bloated and go overboard with the regulations and the red tape, to the point that patients in other countries in Europe, they have access to a lot of treatments that we as Americans just can't access because they're tied up in tape at the FDA. Okay, so Congress has made some attempt to quote unquote regulate the regulators. You know, every once in a while somebody will think, hey, you know, the bureaucracy is going a little overboard here. Maybe we should try and put, you know, at least some checks and balances on the thing. There's something called the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. FOIA requires federal agencies to produce documents if requested. So if you're a reporter or if you're an attorney and you're trying to get documents out of a government agency, you can do that by a FOIA request, and they're obligated by law to respond. Some of the information you want may be blacked out or redacted due to privacy or even national security, but it is a good way to get information out of a government agency. Then we have something called the Administrative Procedure Act. Okay, this requires federal agencies to give notice of proposed regulations and solicit public opinion. So in other words, public agencies, before they issue the final version of a regulation, they're supposed to post it online and have a period of public commentary. So that's helpful, I think. The only problem is that the agency is not required to change the regulation or do anything with the comments that it receives. Okay, so the agency can just ignore the feedback and comments, or they can, you know, take them into account. But at least, you know, there is some period of time for some regulations where the public is allowed a chance to voice their opinion. Finally, there's something called the Sunshine Act. That requires federal agencies to open their meetings to the public unless an exception applies. I can't think of anything more boring than attending a meeting of a federal agency, but if they're talking about a topic that is important to you, you know, this could be an important venue using the Sunshine Act. Some politicians call for a complete elimination of bureaucratic agencies. For example, presidential candidate and senator from Texas, Ted Cruz, when he was running for president back in 2016, you know, he didn't make it very far, but he was going to abolish, you know, at least 5 of the umpteen federal agencies. Okay, but again, these agencies, they get very entrenched, and it's very difficult to scale them back. So the question is, have we traded too much of our precious freedom for the illusion of security? We all agree government should enforce certain standards of safety, quality, and justice. But once a bureaucracy is created, it can easily become overly powerful and overly intrusive. And these excruciatingly detailed regulations can take the place of freedom and common sense. Under a bureaucratic state, people can be harshly punished for violating rules they didn't know existed and doing things that really caused no harm. In addition, bureaucracy can take away our reliance on ourselves and on our community, and cause us to spend hundreds of hours a year on paperwork. I have an article here from the New York Times. It's about a West Point professor named Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade. So he was speaking to a group of wounded veterans. And if there's anybody that deserves our public support, it's our wounded veterans, people who have been injured in the fight for our freedom. And Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade had a very surprising warning to them. The disability checks designed to help troops like them after they leave the service might actually be harmful. And now that's a little bit of a shocking message, trying to discourage disabled veterans from taking money to which they're entitled. But Colonel Gate is not your typical messenger. He's a combat veteran who lost a leg while serving as a tank company commander in Iraq. He says it's a difficult issue to broach. People immediately think you're trying to shortchange veterans, he said, but I'm in a position to do it because I literally have skin in the game. So what basically what Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gade said to these veterans is he says that when you get disability payments, you might think it's crazy to get a job. It's much easier to stay home and just get paid. But he says it's a trap. That especially our veterans need to get out, work, be productive, feel good about themselves. That's where they do well. If they don't have a mission, they don't do well. So the idea is if, our lives have all kinds of harsh edges to them, right? So, we get sick, we lose our jobs, we have different kinds of hardships, we have difficulty finding the things that we need, we have difficulty achieving our dreams. But if the government swoops in and protects us from every single harsh edge in life, then we don't have a mission. We just float through our lives in a lonely kind of way, like the life of Julia. All right, so it's really interesting, this situation that we have now, where that the founders did not anticipate that we have these massive, intrusive bureaucracies trying to take care of us all the time, quote unquote. And the question is, have we traded too much of our freedom for what these agencies define as security? Please prepare for the next lecture. We're going to start our discussion of political parties. I'd like you to please read Federalist Essay 10. It's in your accessible Federalist pages 4 to 9. That's all for today, and I look forward to talking with you next time.